Last time we were talking about heritability, and of course, we're not exactly sure if, you never know whether it's the genes or whether it's the environment that creates the individual. Why in the world do they react that way? Well, potentially it's the genes, but maybe, of course, it has more to do with the environment that has created this problem or this situation with this individual. One situation that doesn't have anything to do with the environment but has everything to do with your genes is phenylketonuria. Urea is urea is a waste product. Phenylketonuria has to do with the waste product of phenylketone. Ketone is a waste product as well. When we metabolize protein, we have to break down the urea that we create. Or the ketones that we create. And that's when we break down protein. So if a baby doesn't have this enzyme that breaks down the phenylketonuria, then the waste product, the phenylketonuria, will accumulate in the brain, and the baby will lose neurons. And therefore it will suffer from an intellectual deficit. How about that? Or disability. Okay. So what we have to do when a baby is born is that we have to feed the baby at least one time something that is protein. The first thing that the baby probably gets, most babies will get sugar water. And of course it tastes good, so the baby will drink it. So that creates something for the baby to digest, for the kidneys to take care of. The next thing that it will get will probably be mother's milk, if the mother is breastfeeding. Or they will feed it a bottle. They need to feed it protein because we need to see if this waste product is being accumulated or if it's being dissipated. If it's being dissipated, we don't have to worry about it. 99.7% of all babies can process phenylketonuria, and they take care of it. Unless you have a child that is a phenylketonuric, and you probably don't because it's not very prevalent in your population. It's prevalent in my population, but it's not prevalent in your population. If you have a child that's a phenylketonuric, then you need to control the foods that you feed this baby. The baby can't eat meats, it can't eat proteins because it can't break down the waste product that's created from the meat. It can't consume dairy products. No cheese, no milk. It can't eat beans, as odd as that seems. It can't eat nuts, and it can't eat anything with protein in it. It can't eat it. It can't eat eggs. So the baby has to stay away from this kind of stuff. And of course, you'll raise the child on a special diet. No meat, no dairy products, no beans, no nuts, no eggs. And if it does eat these things, it will accumulate in the system, and potentially it will cause brain damage. So you have to be very careful what this child eats. That's a child with phenylketonuria. One of the things that we do for all babies when they are born is we draw their blood and check their PKU. We check their phenylketonuria to make sure that they're not accumulating this stuff and causing brain damage. And we certainly don't want that to happen. Another thing that we do is we check their thyroid. We will check to see if they're hypothyroid. If they are hypothyroid, that lowers their metabolism. If their metabolism is lowered, then the development of their brain is stunted. And of course, we need to know that. We need to know if that occurs. There's one more thing that we check sometimes. In some states they check it, in some states they don't. There's a substance in the urine called that smells like maple syrup. Wait a minute. If their urine smells like maple syrup, then it means that they have an enzyme that is missing, and this can cause an intellectual deficit as well. And this is known as maple syrup disease because their urine smells like maple syrup. Did I tell you? Have I ever told you the story about going into the nursery and it smelled like pancakes? Ever tell you that? Oh God, did I get in trouble? So I went into the nursery and I smelled pancakes. I know, it was so crazy. you know, you're not allowed to eat in the nursery. What's going on? Who's making pancakes and eating pancakes? So I told the nurses, I smell pancakes. And they got offended. They were so mad. But as it turned out, of course, they'd been there all night long. So this accumulation of smells, you know, the feces, the urine, all of these accumulations of smells, they hadn't even noticed it. But I came in to draw blood, and of course, my fresh nose, I've been out in the hallway, and I come in, and the first thing I smell is pancakes. Well, this kid had maple syrup disease, and I was the one that found it. But I got in trouble for accusing the nurses of eating pancakes. They were so offended.
Wow. You need to do it in a different way.
I'm a hero, but I got punished for it. You know, it's one of those kind of deals. They would never have noticed. I mean, they were changing diapers and feeding babies, and you know, formula has an odor to it. Anyway, they wouldn't have smelled it. I don't know. Biological treatments are attempts to address assumed underlying biological causes. There are several different types of biological treatments. Convulsive therapy is one. Another is psychosurgery. And the last is, of course, pharmacology, and that's what we primarily use today. In the old days, of course, before they had any psychotropic medications, they had to do whatever they could to help people. And one of the things that they did was convulsive therapies, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They also would do psychosurgery, where they would go in through the sinus cavity into the brain, and they would sever the connections between the hemispheres of the brain, as confusing and strange as that sounds. Early in the 1900s, observations were noted that mentally disturbed people showed improvement in their symptoms after recovering from a convulsion. You can go on the internet and you can see some of these experiments that they were doing. They would give the individual insulin, and they put him in insulin shock, and they would start having convulsions. And afterwards, their depression would go away. Now, if you've ever watched anybody in insulin shock, it's pretty frightening. I mean, they're going into convulsions. They're going into seizures. They're having seizures. But they were doing this purposefully. They were shooting them up with insulin, and then they were shooting them up with some kind of sugar to stop the reaction. But they were purposefully putting them into a convulsion. And it was actually curing their depression. Now the question is, would you do that to yourself? Just to make the depression go away? I don't know. Okay. So that's one of the things that they used to do. Another thing that they used to do was they discovered that if they passed an electric charge through the brain, that it would stop depression. So they would do this with like everybody to see if it worked. You know, one of those kind of strange situations. They use it in electroconvulsive therapy. Now we only use it for people that don't react to any other medications or to any medications. Prozac doesn't work. SSRIs don't work. Tricyclics don't work. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors don't work. And they're deeply depressed. What are we going to do? Well, the only thing we have left is ECT. And ECT works for these guys, for these individuals suffering from severe depression. ECT is more effective in the short term than antidepressant medications in the treatment of severe depression, and we know that normally the brain is trying to protect itself. It's trying to heal itself. So it will try to do anything to make itself better. So if the brain is suffering from depression, the brain will produce more and more serotonin. It'll try to produce more and more serotonin. It will create what they refer to as an upregulation of serotonin receptor sites, so that if there is serotonin out there, it will be able to find it. So the brain is trying to protect itself. It's trying to cure itself. And this is a constant process. It's always looking for a state of homeostasis. Constantly. So it's very difficult for you to stay depressed for an extended length of time. You may be severely depressed. You may stay depressed for a couple days or a couple weeks, but your brain is trying to fix itself. It's going to do something to make you feel better. It's seeking that homeostasis. It's seeking a balance. Okay. Magnetic seizure therapy is therapy where there is stimulation of the brain regions using magnetic fields at sufficient strength to result in convulsions. So it puts you into convulsions. Once again, this is a convulsion therapy. So it puts you into magnets. Let's stick magnets on our head and see what happens there. Okay. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is therapy that uses repeated magnetic pulses at sub-seizure levels of intensity. So it doesn't really put you into convulsions, it puts you in a pre-convulsive state. And because of that, it actually corrects your depression. They tried this, but it's not as effective as ECT. So sending the electrical charge through your brain is more effective than the magnets. Sorry. Vagus nerve stimulation has been approved by the FDA for use with treatment-resistant depression. VNS uses implanted electrodes in specific areas of the brain. And as you can see, the stimulator is here on your chest, and they have electrodes that run up to your vagus nerve. And it stimulates it, and theoretically, of course, that will cause convulsions, and the convulsions will cure you of your depression. What we do for depression. Now the problem is, of course, that the medications aren't working. Any pharmaceutical that you're using isn't working properly. So that's one of the reasons why we're shocking you, why we're throwing magnets at your head, and why we're electrocuting you with electrocuting your vagus nerve, trying to make you less depressed. Okay. This is really kind of exciting because this guy, Antonio Moniz, is the individual that invented frontal lobotomies. He's the first guy to do lobotomies. He developed the technique. The exciting thing is, in 1949, he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the development of frontal lobotomies. Frontal lobotomy procedure was started in about 1935. They had violent patients that they couldn't control. So they decided that they would do this radical surgery to see if it improved their behavior. And it worked. Sometimes it made them into vegetables. Why? Because it was severing the connections between the lobes of the brain. That's what he was doing. But only about a third of the time it worked, strangely enough. And despite that, in 1949, of course, this is 14 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for developing the procedure. There must have been nothing else going on in 1949 if he got the Nobel Prize in medicine for frontal lobotomies. This is still a procedure that is used in emergency situations. If the individual is so dangerous, is so agitated that you can't control them, then potentially they will, if it is approved, then they will go in and do a frontal lobotomy. It does remain experimental. It still only works about a third of the time, but it's one of the things that we have to try if we have no other way of treating something. And this is an extreme situation. Pharmacology, the focus is the use of drugs, of course. We're trying to find drugs that work. This impacts the neurotransmission in the brain, all of these psychopharmacology, psychopharmaceuticals, that's it, psychopharmaceuticals. Over 11% of American adults received psychotropic medications in 2002. 11%. That would be 2 of us in this room. We're taking some kind of psychotropic. Probably, potentially antidepressants, maybe an anti-anxiety medication. Those are fairly common. But there may be somebody in here, I may be as more psychotic than you think I am. Maybe I act so erratically because I'm actually psychotic. Maybe I'm taking risperidone. I'm not, but I could. I don't know. They keep telling me it's high blood pressure medicine. You think that's true? Sheldon's in the back going, yeah, no, it's risperidone. The drug revolution has resulted in symptom relief, but none of the medications correct or resolve the biological condition presumed to underlie the symptoms. We only treat symptoms. We cannot cure you. We can't fix you. That's not what pharmaceuticals do. Psychopharmaceuticals. Yes, I know. All these words are coming into my brain. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe it really is risperidone. Before 1900, alcohol, heroin, cocaine, and various other sedative hypnotics and stimulant substances were used as treatments for mental disorders. We didn't know. None of this stuff was considered a narcotic. It wasn't considered a narcotic until the beginning of the 20th century. So you could drink all the opium, all the laudanum you wanted. That's opium, tincture of opium. Tincture means it was dissolved in alcohol. There you go. Opium. Let's mix our opium with alcohol. Good idea. By 1950, none of this stuff started occurring until 1950. So if you had a mental illness in the 1940s, what did we do for you? Well, we didn't have any pills to throw at you. So what did we do next? Well, we probably did some of the convulsive therapies. They sometimes put people in ice baths. And that hurts. I don't want to be put, I like a warm bath, okay, not an ice bath. But it wasn't until the 1950s that we started developing any of these psychotropics. Benzodrine, which is an amphetamine, was used for hyperactivity in the 1950s. Lithium salts, we started using lithium salts for bipolar disorder to treat the mania primarily. Not to treat the depression, but to treat the mania. Lithium salts it's a heavy metal. It's poison. This stuff is poison. It's like lead, you know. Don't eat it. This stuff is poison. Antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs were developed in the 1950s. When reductions in the psychological symptoms were noted after the use of antihistamines and tuberculosis medications, respectively, then all of a sudden we realized, wait a minute, we're treating these guys with this medication, and it actually takes away some of the depression and some of the psychosis. But we were using it for tuberculosis, patients with tuberculosis. We were using it for individuals that had sinus problems. We were using antihistamines, and it was actually changing people's moods. So we were giving them cold capsules, and by golly, they weren't depressed anymore. What's going on? This doesn't make any sense. Let's give them the antihistamines and see what happens next. The revolutionary development of antipsychotic and antidepressant medications also led to the development of biological theories of the disorders that they treated. In other words, we started treating them, and then we came up with the theories that fit why this treatment worked. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia purports that the disorder is caused by excessive dopamine activity in the brain. We have too many dopamine receptor sites. Our dopamine is gathering all this sensory information. We have all this information coming in. Those of us who are not psychotic, we can filter out all that information. We don't need to think about what we're smelling, the popcorn. I can't smell the popcorn. I was just kidding. But I see the popcorn. I don't know what those are. What's in the yellow bag, but I can't smell it anyway. Okay, so we have all this information coming in. That damn thing keeps making noise, and it just bugs the crap out of me. I can't stand behind that thing. I can't talk to you guys coming back there. I can, but I have comments. It makes so much noise. So we have all this information coming in. Can we filter out all this information? And the idea was that we have so many dopamine receptor sites that we're collecting information that we shouldn't be collecting. So we start hearing voices. We think that aliens from outer space are communicating with us. I know, that's a psychotic reaction. Interesting stuff. I know. So, dopamine hypothesis has to do with the fact that you have too many dopamine receptor sites. So if we can block some of those dopamine receptor sites, guess what happens next? This guy that's hearing voices from aliens in outer space, all of a sudden he stops hearing voices from aliens from outer space. I used to work in a rural clinic in Oklahoma, and right outside of the town that I was working in was an Gappi Ranch. If you know anything about Gappi Ranches, they are rural farms that they put together, and then they bring in individuals that are suffering from schizophrenia, they're suffering from different types of mental illnesses. Agape means friend. It just means, that you're going to take care of somebody. So there are Gappi ranches, and this happened with us. So we would get to treat some of the individuals at the Gappi Ranch, and some of the people out there were schizophrenic. And we had one guy that stopped taking his medication and started listening to those voices that were talking to him from outer space. I know, it's kind of interesting. And the only guy he wanted to talk to Ronald Reagan. Well, Reagan was the president. He was in a hospital in someplace in California suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Not important. He wanted to talk to Ronald Reagan because Ronald Reagan was his favorite president. Now, who in the world could possibly communicate with Ronald Reagan? Me, of course. Obviously, it's me. I was in the Air Force. I mean, us military guys, don't we have a direct line with the president? Even the former president, right? Don't you call Reagan up on the phone? I hope you don't anymore. He's gone. But how about Jimmy Carter? You communicate with him every once in a while, don't you? No, not very often. Talked to him last night. We were complaining about the State of the Union address. Oh man! You don't. Anyway, this guy thought that I could communicate with Ronald Reagan. So, and he stopped taking his medication, of course. So he started beating everybody up at the place, throwing people through walls. Really kind of fascinating. And finally, they got him in a straitjacket and they brought him out. And as soon as he saw me, everything was fine. He wasn't fighting them anymore. He just wanted to see me. As attractive as I was, there must be something wrong with this guy. It's because I communicate with Reagan all the time. Well, he's gone now, but Jimmy Carter, now I get to communicate with Jimmy Carter. But he thought that because I had been in the military, that of course I had a direct line to Jimmy Carter. Not to Jimmy Carter, but Ronald Reagan. The way we got him, we had to life flight him out because he was, if I wasn't there, the guy was just erratic. We couldn't control him. So the way that we got him to Oklahoma City was I convinced him that he needed to get on the helicopter because the communication line would start in Oklahoma City. I didn't have a direct line here. We needed to take him to Oklahoma City. And this guy's a really logical person, and I couldn't tell these fabulous lies. He wouldn't believe them. I mean, everything had to make sense. So that's how we got him on the helicopter. But we were okay as long as I talked to him. Of course, I was working as a nurse in the clinic and as a lab tech. So it just so happened that I have the clinical ability to take care of that situation. Anyway, the dopamine hypothesis has to do with the fact that you have too many dopamine receptor sites, and if we can throw a medication at you that blocks the dopamine receptor sites, then it will take away your erratic behaviors. The catecholamine hypothesis of depression purports that the mood disorder resulted from a relative depletion of norepinephrine in your brain. So if we can increase your norepinephrine level, or we can increase the serotonin level, we can take the depression away. So what we do is we try to give you a medication that will increase your serotonin level, or your norepinephrine level. That's what we do. And that's tricyclics, that's monoamine oxidase inhibitors, but it's especially SSRIs. We're using a lot of SSRIs now, mainly because there are no side effects. When Prozac was first invented and we first started using it, they were saying that it's 90% effective. Then it went down to 75%, then it went down to 70%, then it went down, well, it's pretty close to 60%. Why? Because there are some depressions that aren't being caused by serotonin. It has another cause. Okay. Let's feed some more. Well, let's talk about something else. There are significant concerns about psychotropic medication side effects. If you take a medication, especially a phenothiazine or a phenothiazine derivative, One of the problems is that you get a permanent tic. And it can be any kind of a facial tic, it could be an arm movement, and you can't control it. And this is known as tardive dyskinesia. It especially happens in your face. Your muscles become permanently twitchy, and they will twitch the same way every time. And there's nothing you can do about it. And that is referred to as tardive dyskinesia. Now this is the old stuff. Phenothiazines are that's the old medications for schizophrenia. There are new medications for schizophrenia, and they don't cause tardive dyskinesia. But unfortunately, they do something else. They give you a form of leukemia called granulocytosis, which is a precursor to leukemia. And it can be fatal, of course. And unfortunately, this is the new medications we have for treating psychosis. Additional medications are frequently prescribed to help patients control the side effects of psychotropic medications. One of the things that we do is we can treat your bipolar disorder very well with lithium salts, with lithium chloride. And if we treat you with lithium chloride, usually what we do is we also give you an antidepressant. And that's because lithium only fixes mania. It doesn't fix depression. So we have to give you and that is a side effect, is the fact that now that you're no longer manic, you also have depression. The depression becomes more severe. So we have to treat you with an antidepressant. Anyway. The earliest model developed to treat mental problems was the psychodynamic model. It was developed by Sigmund Freud in the middle of the 19th century. The later part of the 19th century. The 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and at the turn of the century. He and his colleagues developed a way of treating this called psychoanalysis. Their thought was that their problems were caused from an internal, unconscious problem from the individual's development. Freud's idea was that you had a problem when you were a child. And because you had a problem, because you fixated on something, now it is affecting you as an adult. And that's where your problems have come from. Okay? Because the cause is unconscious, to get to the root cause of the patient's problem takes a great deal of therapy and careful observation by the therapist. We have to talk to you, but it's unconscious. It's not like you can go, the other day I was thinking about what's going on in my unconscious. No, your unconscious is not, you can't tap into your unconscious. You can't think, let me go into my unconscious. You can't do that. You can only go into your conscious, of course. So in order to get to your unconscious, it's very difficult. It takes a long time. You have to use select techniques to get into somebody's unconscious. Freud's theory evolved during a time in Europe when there was a lot of sexual repression. If you think about, and I was thinking about this earlier today, one of the, this is in the middle of the 19th century. We call that the Victorian era. And they were wearing dresses that went all the way to the floor. They never wore short-sleeved anything. Everything was long-sleeved, and it came all the way to the wrist. So we've got this lovely outfit on that goes all the way to the floor. It also comes all the way up to the neck, all the way up to your chin. So it covers your neck. And the idea was that men were so responsive to females that if we showed them any skin whatsoever, that they would become uncontrollable. So let's cover everything up. And they did. They wore veils. They had dresses. They wore gloves on their hands. They showed no skin whatsoever. As compared to now, of course. Now, we're not nearly as sexually repressed as we were then. This clothing style went on into the 20th century. So for 50 years, women were covering themselves completely. And it was a great time of sexual repression, not only for males, but also for females, but especially for females. because they were the ones that were forced to wear all these clothes. Now, if you think about it, if we go to a Muslim country, some of the Muslim countries, they cover their women completely. They wear a burqa, and it covers them completely. You can't see anything but their eyes. And in essence, the Victorian era did exactly the same thing. You covered everything. So it was a time of sexual repression. And this is what Freud was dealing with. He was dealing with women that were suffering from sexual repression. They weren't allowed to think about sex. They covered up the legs of the table because they called them legs. I know, and he might look at a leg and think, a lady's leg. I don't know. Yeah. So they started calling the legs of the table the limbs of the table, because you have limbs in trees. You have legs. Only people have legs, I guess. Anyway, so all of this was taking place. Really, kind of an odd time. It was very sexually repressed, and because of that, he came up with his psychosexual theory of psychology. And it was the first one that we ever came up with. But there was a lot of trouble. I mean, people were having tons and tons of problems. I told you about the lady who had hysterical blindness because she saw her husband's penis. She wasn't supposed to see these things, and because she saw it, she felt so guilty that she went blind. As strange as that seems. Okay, so it's a really odd time out there. And because of this, he saw all the problems that people had, all the depression, all the anxiety, all the guilt that people were feeling. He saw that as part of sexual repression. Because when he treated women for their problems, it usually had something to do with the fact that they were repressing their sexuality. And that's why Freud came up with his theory. He was also much influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. He therefore saw humanity's need to reproduce just as in any other animal, and we do have this instinct to reproduce as our prime driving force. So he came up with his own psychosexual theory. And his psychosexual theory was based on the fact that we have this desire to reproduce, but we can't think about it, we can't do anything about it, so we have to repress it. And of course, he saw all of these problems, depression, anxiety, all of these problems were coming out of this sexual repression. The abnormality was caused when the normal sexual drive got in the way of social convictions, forcing the individual to either do something that would be frowned on by the social conventions or deny their sexual needs. And that's normally what happened. They denied their sexual needs. Isn't this sad? I know. Okay. In most cases, the sexual needs are repressed and the individual develops some form of pathology, usually a neuroses. They develop depression. They develop anxiety. They develop an excessive guilt. They develop a hysteria. Why in the world, just because you saw something, would you go blind? Because she felt like she wasn't supposed to see anything. And when she saw it, it struck her blind. There was nothing wrong with her eyes. She felt so guilty about seeing her husband's penis that she went hysterically blind, even though there was nothing wrong with her eyes, as odd as that seems. So we have all of these repressed ideas, and these are causing our problems. Freud felt that each of us is born with our animal reproductive needs, and this he referred to as the id. We have this. All children have this. This is the driving force. This will be the driving force throughout our entire lives. Will be our need to reproduce. But we will guide it in different directions, so that it doesn't change the way that we are. It's just a need that we have. And this is, he referred to this animal instinct. He referred to it as the id. Id is Latin for it. So it was the it. The id is made up of instinctual needs, drives, and impulses. The id's focus is obtaining whatever it wants. This is done through the pleasure principle. It's always seeking a good time. For a good time call, the id. The id is there for a good time. The drive that fuels us is our sexual energy. This is our This is something that gives us our ability to go from one place to the other. It gives us our energy, it gives us our drive, and this he referred to as your libido. Theoretically, it was your sex drive. But it didn't especially have to do with sex. It just had to do with your drive to succeed, to go forward. In medicine, we have a thing called failure to thrive. Have I talked about this? Failure to thrive? It's like a baby is born without the spark of life. It's the most bizarre thing in the world. The baby doesn't cuddle. The baby doesn't suckle. The baby doesn't thrive, and it's failure to thrive. And sometimes these individuals will apathy themselves to death because they won't eat, they don't grow, and they die. They just don't have the drive to do something. You know, sometimes you get angry and you go outside and you just run around the block because you're pissed. Well, where did that come from? Well, you know, you've got the drive to do it. It's there. Anyway, so we've got the libido, we've got the it, we've got the id, and it operates by the pleasure principle. The libido will fuel our drive for the rest of our lives, and this is one of the things I was saying before. The libido fuels the id through the initial stage of life, the stage that focuses on eating. So the very first thing that the baby must do in order to survive is eat. And if the baby doesn't eat, the baby dies. But this doesn't happen very often because we have this drive to survive. And that drive is fueled by the libido, as far as Freud was concerned. So the first focus as infants is on eating. And if you've ever been around a baby, it doesn't really care about anything. You can't tell it not to poop its pants or its diaper. It'll do it anyway. As soon as you change the diaper, he urinates. And then you change that diaper, and then he urinates again. You know, you can't control this kid. This kid has no control. Well, he's doing whatever he wants to do. That's the pleasure principle. And he is like an animal that is desiring things. But eventually, of course, the child grows up. They become older. And they need to become socially responsible. And at this stage, so everything is food and the baby being happy, and that's all the baby cares about. So the baby's getting a little bit older. It's 1.5 years old. And at this stage, we need to start controlling the child. And we will. We'll start controlling the child. So we potty train the child. The child has to be socially responsible. And so we potty train the child. At that stage, the baby has to develop its individual identity. Before it's 18 months old, it identifies itself as part of its mother, or part of whoever's taking its caregiver, whoever the caregiver is. It identifies itself as part of the caregiver. So it doesn't have an individual identity until it becomes about 18 months old, and you have to make the child responsible for its own bowel movements. And at this stage, you potty train the child. At this stage, it develops an individuality. And this is known as the ego. It develops its sense of self. And it's called ego. Ego in Latin means I, me. It's me. So before it was an it, and it was part of its mother. It felt like it's part of its mother. Now it has a self-identity, according to Freud. Because it has to start living in the real world, and it's not being taken care of, it can't just load its diaper up like it was doing before. Now it operates by the reality principle. So the ego, not only does it operate by the reality principle, but it also focuses on this need to be socially responsible. And so what is the most important thing about being socially responsible? It's not filling its pants up. It's potty training. So it's focused now, whereas before its focus was on its mouth, the oral stage, now it's focused on potty training, or the anal stage, because it has to think about not pooping its pants. Does all that make sense? may not be true, but this is what Freud said. So this is the anal stage, or the ego stage. I'm sorry. This is it is the anal stage. I'm sorry. And the baby has developed its ego. One of the things that the baby will do is that now that it lives in the real world rather than the fun world, now it will try to control its feelings of guilt. And it will do that through ego defense mechanisms. So it will develop all these ego defense mechanisms. They will potentially, will be their coping technique for the rest of their life. Whenever something bad happens and they have bad thoughts, they will use an ego defense mechanism to suppress these evil thoughts that they have. So one of the ego defense mechanisms is repression. In other words, we try not to think about something. We try not to think about it at all. We're not in denial because we don't believe that it's there. So we pretended that it's not there. And this is known as repression. You just don't think about it. Let's see. Okay, repression. Denial, on the other hand, is it's not the fact that you don't think about it, it's the fact that you deny that it's important. So denial is another ego defense mechanism. A third ego defense mechanism, okay, so I've been married a couple times, and I have an ex-wife, and we had a bad time there for a while, and she was messing around. And I pretended that it wasn't happening. I was in denial. I knew it was happening, but I didn't respond to it. I didn't confront her, I didn't do anything. I just pretended that everything would be okay. I was in denial. So that's an ego defense mechanism. I was just in denial about dealing with it.
Is acceptance and denial the same thing?
I'm sorry?
Is acceptance and denial the same thing?
No, it's the opposite, as a matter of fact. So acceptance is, yeah, that's happening. But denial is, no, it's not happening at all. You know, I could have accepted the fact that she was having an affair with some army. Not they weren't army guys, they were Air Force guys. With a bunch of guys. Anyway, I could have accepted that, but I didn't. I was in denial. I was pretending it didn't happen at all. I knew it was going on, but I was pretending, in my mind, I was saying that it wasn't happening. So I was in denial. Acceptance means that you know it's happening and you accept it. But I was saying that it wasn't happening, even though I knew it was happening. You know, this is ugly. Wait a minute, it gets better. So she was having an affair. And guess what happened next? She accused me of having an affair. Well, I wasn't having an affair. I was at an all-male college. Who was I going to have an affair with? The lunch lady? What's going on? But she accused me of having an affair. Why? Because she was having an affair. Wait a minute. That's projection. That's where you take unacceptable impulses and project them on somebody else. So despite the fact that she was the one that was having an affair, she accused me of having an affair. Projection. She was utilizing projection. I know. It gets sadder.
So was she like denying the thing? She put back up on?
No, she knew what was going on. I don't know why she thought I was having an affair. Maybe she wanted me to have an affair so that she wouldn't feel so guilty. Projection. Okay. I know. Crazy ladies. Only one. There's only one crazy lady out there, and why in the world did I ever marry her? Rationalization, intellectualizing a socially acceptable reason for an action that actually reflects unacceptable desires. We won't use I won't give you an example of that. Reaction formation, adopting behavior that is the exact opposite of the impulses that you are afraid to acknowledge. Reaction formation, this happened with my current wife's mother. The first time I met her, she just treated me like I was the most wonderful person in the world. I'm going, wow, this is great. She's really nice. So we stayed 3 days with my mother-in-law before we flew over to Germany. My wife was stationed in Germany, and I was going to join her. So we got on the airplane, and as we were in the air, her mother, my wife's mother, called her and said, "He's the biggest piece of crap in the world. I can't see how you can stand him." She treated me like she treated me like gold. She loved my kids. She told my wife that she hated my kids. What the hell's going on? It was a reaction formation. She was treating us the opposite of the way that she felt. Yeah. Crazy lady. See, mother-in-laws, they're trouble. Displacement, displacing hostility away from a dangerous object and onto a safer substitute. I get in trouble at work. Somebody yells at me at work. Go home, guess what happens to the dog? I kick the dog. I can't punch the person that's giving me a hard time, so I go home and kick the dog. Displacement. I'm displacing my anger on somebody else. Or I yell at my wife, except my wife isn't here. She'd probably punch me too. Anyway, so I can't do that. Okay. These are the last ones. Intellectualization, detachment. Individual suppresses emotional reaction by giving a flat, emotionless, overly logical response. This is what my wife accuses me of. Intellectualizing. Anytime she tells me that there's a problem, I try to tell her, I'm a psychologist, so I tell her what's right. She hates it. She despises it. Regression is retreating from an upsetting conflict by reacting in a more immature manner than your age, going back to a safer developmental stage. I've told you guys the story before, but I'm going to tell it again for the people that haven't heard the story. My wife was stationed in Korea. She was the hospital administrator and the head nurse. She and the head nurse hung around together because when you're in Korea and you're around all those guys, the more people around, the better off, the safer you are. So she would go to dinner with the head nurse. Well, the head nurse, of course, was a head nurse. Head nurses are always the grouchiest people in the world. They have the deepest voices of all the females I've ever heard. They have this really deep voice. So when they're ordering people around, they're telling people what to do, they got this really deep voice when they're telling people what to do. And this lady, of course, she would accompany my wife to the chow hall, chow hall, it's chow hall in the military. So she'd go to the officers club with my wife. And so, she would be all gruff and everything, and then she would walk into the officers club, and all of a sudden her voice would get higher, and she started talking in a much higher voice. Well, it's not the regression yet. This lady had just gotten married. She's just gotten married to a pilot. Pilots wear these really tight clothes. Pilots do. We used to refer to them as pickle suits, but they're just this one-piece outfit, and they're really tight. I mean, when you get into an airplane, you need your clothes to be kind of tight. So they would wear these pickle suits out in public, and of course they're relatively tight, and they're tight clothes. So she had just gotten married, and her husband wasn't with her. So she was married to the love of her life, and of course her voice would change when she went inside. But the problem was her husband wasn't there, so she saw all of these guys in their pickle suits. Well, why did she fall in love with her husband? Her husband was a pilot, and of course that's what she fell in love with, the pickle suit, the whole thing. So she's got all these guys that these young pilots are running around, and she sees all these guys, and she's attracted to some of them. So one of the things that happened was really kind of fascinating. So one day she goes into the officers club, and what does she do? But she starts acting like a little girl. She starts acting like a teenager. She starts giggling and sitting on men's laps, asking for quarters so she can go play the jukebox. I mean, who does this? This is the head nurse. This lady's in her 40s, and she's acting like she's a teenager. A cheerleader like she was when she was in high school, before she started having sex. She had to regress back in order to protect herself from the pilots. And she didn't realize that she was doing it. My wife said it was like a switch flip in her brain. It was the most bizarre thing in the world. She had regressed back in order to protect herself from the pilots. She had regressed back to a time before she started having sex, so that she wouldn't be sexually attracted to these guys, as bizarre as that sounds. They call them pickle suits because they're green, okay? they're green, they're the same color as a pickle.
Is this all stress-induced?
Yes, this all has to do with feelings of guilt.
So are these like long-term, like they get stuck in these long-term, or is it, can they be short episodes?
Well, it can be short episodes, but usually it's long-term because the guilt just doesn't go away. We still have these ideas. Unless the guilt-inducing something actually goes away, then you'll maintain this for an extended length of time. Not only that, but if you have another problem, if you're under stress again, this is how you'll cope. You'll rationalize, you'll intellectualize, you'll regress. So it becomes a coping technique for you. It becomes the way that you handle stress. If your way of handling stress is getting drunk, then under stress, of course, you're going to pick up a tequila bottle and start chug-a-lugging the tequila water, because that's your way of coping.
Can new coping skills be learned?
Yes, and that's what Freud was trying to do. Freud was trying to teach new coping skills. He was trying to identify the old coping skills and create new coping skills that were more adaptive. And that's what psychodynamic theory is all about, is establishing new coping skills. Okay, so regression. It's a sadder story than I told because the guy was in Colorado Springs. He just retired from the military, and it turned out he was having an affair. So the whole thing blew up after the lady came home, despite the fact that she was begging quarters from the guys at the officers club. So there's always a sad part to it, to every story, I guess. Anyway, she was regressing, and that's the way she was able to cope with these attractive men who were flirting with her. And actually, it changed the way they flirted with her, because when she regressed, they regressed. So when she went back to high school, they started acting like guys from high school. So they weren't hitting on her nearly as much as they were before. It's really kind of bizarre. Of course, my wife is taking all of this in, and she's calling me on the telephone. My goodness, what's happening here? And it took us about a month to figure out why in the world, every time she went into the officers club, why she acted like that. My wife was just dumbfounded. I mean, her voice changed, everything changed. It was just bizarre. The last type of ego defense mechanism is sublimation, expressing sexual and aggressive energy in ways that are acceptable to society. Things like painting, like crafts. So rather than do whatever it is that you're fantasizing, these individuals will go out and paint the barn really fast because they're trying to sublimate their sexual energies. Between age 3 and 5 years after we become potty trained, our area of focus becomes our sexual parts. This stage of development is known as the phallic stage. This is one of the reasons why Freud is disliked by some individuals. They accuse him of sexism. And the reality was, everybody was sexist at that time. But he was less sexist than other individuals. So they really shouldn't attack him. Everybody was sexist, and since everybody was sexist, he was probably less sexist than anybody else out there. But he referred to this, of course, as the phallic stage or the penis stage. During this stage, males go through what is known as the Oedipal conflict, where they desire to possess their opposite sex parent. So they desire to possess their mother. Now, they don't want to have sex with their mother. This is one of the things that people misunderstand. It's not that they want to have sex with her. They just want to control her. They want her to pay more attention to them than to the male figure in the family. And that's known as the Oedipal conflict. And this has to be resolved. This has to be resolved for the child to start identifying with its same-sex parent. The most important thing to a little boy is identifying with a male figure. The most important thing with a little girl is identifying with a female in the family. Okay, so they desire to control them, and of course this just means that they want more attention from their opposite sex parent than they do than the father or the mother is getting. This is resolved by accepting the inability to compete with the same-sex parent and thus identifying with the same-sex parent. They can't compete against them because, well, this is a marriage. This is a relationship. So they can't really compete against them. So they have to start identifying with the same-sex parent. So the little boy starts identifying with his father, starts following him around, starts mimicking his father. The little girl starts doing the same thing with the mother. She starts identifying with the mother and she starts following around. And that is a resolved conflict. This resolving of the Oedipal conflict results in the development of your superego. So if your father is a conservative Trumpian Republican, then all of a sudden your conscience becomes very similar to his. So you start identifying with his ideas. Your conscience, you develop a conscience, and that is your superego, as exciting as that is. So if you have the same ideas as a parent of yours, then it's probably because you identify with that parent. And of course, this is all has to do with the Oedipal conflict and the Electra conflict. Because the child is now adopting the parent's values through the identification of the same-sex parent, the superego is able to develop. The child will resolve the Oedipal conflict at about age 5 and pass into a period where there is little going on sexually. So from the first grade, from kindergarten until the child goes through puberty, they're not going to be very sexual as far as Freud was concerned. They're not going to be sexual beings anymore. This is the best time to teach school. So if you want to teach these kids, don't teach junior high kids because they're nuts. Why are they so crazy? Because they've started to go through puberty. The hormones have started surging in their system. But if you get a hold of a kid in the first or second or third grade before any of those hormones start, they're just as sweet as pie. The easiest grades to teach are the elementary school grades until they go through puberty. When puberty starts, all bets are off. They become monsters. Write that down. Monsters. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Wow. I was teaching at a junior high school. Oh man, it was terrible. The 5th and 6th graders, gee, Christmas, they drove me crazy. And I'm not a very good disciplinarian. I'm terrible. I was a terrible sergeant. I apologize. I was an E6, but I was horrible. I mean, I would do all the work, rather than tell my subordinates to do anything. I was just a terrible leader. That's why I like teaching. This is kind of fun. But I'm a terrible disciplinarian. Just horrible. Okay, so nothing's going on sexually. So what they refer to this stage as is the latency stage. And it lasts until they go through puberty, until they start puberty. And if you can remember your own puberty, it was a time when there were a lot of crazy things going on in your brain. It was a very confusing time. There's a reason why there was, and of course this doesn't have to do with Freud, he didn't understand this, but there's a reason why there's a lot of strange things going on in your head. Your brain is repairing itself. It's changing from a child's brain into an adult brain. So it's taking out a lot of things and it's putting in a lot of things. One of the things that it takes out is your language learning capability. You have this ability to learn language very, very rapidly. But that area of your brain is pruned out as soon as you go through puberty, unfortunately. So it's far more difficult for us to learn languages after we go through puberty. If we learn it before puberty, no sweat. We'll keep it for the rest of our lives. My kids, we were over in Germany when they were, before they went through puberty, and both of them learned German, and both of them can still speak German despite they never speak it. But they can read it, they can understand it. It's really kind of interesting. So that's my kids. my cool kids. So the latency period is right after the phallic stage. The puberty, but of course, once puberty takes place, all bets are off. Puberty triggers the individual's desires to have sex with the opposite sex since they identify with their same-sex parent, and they go into the genital stage, and they'll stay in the genital stage for the rest of their lives. They will be reproductive beings for the rest of their lives. There you go, that's Freud. Was he right? Was he wrong? A lot of people say he was wrong. One of the reasons they say he was wrong is because he couldn't do research to back up his theory. He was never able to do that. But then this was the very beginning of psychology, and it was the very beginning of research. So he was never able to confirm any of his theories. Freud felt that the thought and memory that we could recall only amounted to about 10% of our total mind structure. It looks like an iceberg, and we use that as a symbol for this concept all the time. That actually we have a lot of information that we've forgotten, that is we can't tap into, and this is our unconscious. The rest lay hidden in a rarely tapped mass known as the collective unconscious. So 90% of everything that's happened to us, you know, what did you have for lunch on April 3rd in 2016? What did you have for lunch? Does anybody know what they had for lunch on April 3rd, 2016? Of course you know. Why in the world would you remember something like that? You're not Sheldon Cooper. You're not a television star on Big Bang Theory, so you don't have an eidetic memory. So why in the world would you remember that? I mean, that would be ridiculous. And if you could remember it, it might cause you to go insane, because you're remembering things that are unnecessary. Why in the world would you remember that? I've had telephone numbers all over the world. I've had zip codes. I can't remember any of them, except my parents. I can remember my parents' zip code. Sometimes I can remember this zip code. 86556. Okay, I'm doing okay. It's taken me a year and a half to remember my zip code here. Well, I have to remember my other zip code because when I get gasoline, it's billed out of Iowa, so I have to remember 52254. I have to remember that in order for me to get gasoline. So I have to remember that, but I don't remember my zip code in Texas. I don't remember my zip code in Oklahoma. I don't remember my zip code in Montana. No, I don't. I don't remember it. This is unnecessary information, but it's somewhere in my collective unconscious, potentially, and what I had for lunch on April 3rd in 2016. You know, all of this is unnecessary information. So where does it go? Well, obviously it goes someplace, and Freud thought that it went into the collective unconscious. To get glimpses into the collective unconscious, Freud relied on talking therapy. Now remember, we're repressing all of these ideas. We're pushing all these ideas that make us feel bad. All this information, the stuff that happened to us when we were kids, the fact that we didn't get the right Christmas present when we were 5 years old. We repressed this idea. We were upset at the time, and it created a problem that now we need to deal with that. Actually, whatever your present was doesn't make any difference. Most of the problems have to do with sex. It has to do with sex. Okay, so we need to, and a lot of these don't have to do with actual physical sex. It has to do with ideas of sex. So if we're dealing with an individual that murders and rapes women and then has sex with their dead bodies, where does this come from? Why does he have this idea? Why does he have this need to kill women, rape them, and then continue to rape their dead bodies? Well, who does this? Where does this desire come from? But he does it over and over and over and over again. So it's in there somewhere. And the reason for this is in his collective unconscious. And Freud felt that we need to get in there to find out what it is. And if we can tell him what the reason that he does it, maybe he'll stop. Right now, this desire, he doesn't understand where it comes from. But he has this desire. Women equal dead. Women equal rape. Women equal have sex with dead bodies. where does this come from? So one of the things that we need to do, one of the things that Freud felt that we needed to do, was we need to tap into this collective unconscious. That was an extreme example. Most people don't murder and rape people. I think most people, and then have sex with the dead bodies. Of course, that doesn't happen. I was just using that as an extreme example. But somebody may desire to have sex with dogs, or somebody may have a desire to have sex with children, or to have sex with somebody that they shouldn't be having sex with. And we need to find out where this comes from. Maybe somebody can't get excited unless they beat somebody through, they beat somebody so that their face is bloody. Where does that come from? Why in the world is it in there? And of course, this is one of the reasons why we have to try to tap into this to figure out why they do what they do. And if we can tell them why they do it, if they can tell us why they do it, then maybe by bringing it into their conscious, they'll stop doing it. That's the hope, anyway. And that works. It kind of works. Sometimes. Okay. So we have this collective unconscious. One of the ways we can get into this collective unconscious is through talking therapy. We allow the individual to talk. And sometimes words will come from your collective unconscious. Normally it's just your conscious, your conscious thought. But sometimes we can tap into that collective unconscious. And we can get information from that collective unconscious. But it takes a long time. We have to talk to people for an extended length of time. And we have to do it in a special way. So if I'm doing therapy, if I'm doing psychotherapy with somebody, they can't see me and I don't talk. I just let you say anything that comes into your mind. There are two times when your collective unconscious is available. One of them is when you're dreaming, and the other one is when you're talking and you're not protecting what you're saying. You're just talking.
What about like during hypnosis?
What
about like during hypnosis?
Hypnosis, Freud tried hypnosis. He didn't like it. What he discovered was that people, that was the first thing he tried, was getting into the collective unconscious through hypnosis. Mesmer used it, Bueller used it, these individuals that came before Freud, they used hypnosis, but he felt that he was getting incorrect information. He felt that he was getting fake information, that it wasn't real, that you could block what you say even during hypnosis. So he couldn't get into it. So he didn't use hypnosis. But he did use dream analysis, and he did use the talking therapies.
What about drugs?
He tried cocaine, and he found that, it doesn't have anything to do with the unconscious. How in the world do you get into that stuff? What kind of a drug would you have to give somebody to tap into the portion of your brain that you can't get into? And he couldn't find it. He just couldn't find it. It didn't work. Nothing worked except for the talking therapy. So unfortunately, of course, by using free association, and he would say, okay, let's talk about rutabagas. Last time you were talking about rutabagas. So let's talk about rutabagas. Well, rutabagas aren't important. But he was talking about them before, so now when he starts talking about rutabagas, he's going to start putting together sentences, and potentially something in there will have something to do with his collective unconscious. That's the idea. This takes years. It really does. If somebody's got the money to do it, I guess that's what they do. Free association has to do with the way that they connect different things. So the type of therapy that it is, they use free association. The other is dream analysis. Write down your dreams. Tell me what you dreamed about. Tell me about things that were happening in your dreams. And a lot of times you can block your collective unconscious while you're awake, but while you're asleep you can't do that. And so some of your dreams will have to do with what's going on in your collective unconscious. I know this is kind of out there somewhere. Now the interesting thing about psychoanalysis, the psychodynamic theory, is that it's still used today in Europe. It's still very prevalent in Europe. We don't use it as much in the United States. We use far more rapid means of psychotherapy, but they use this relatively frequently, psychodynamic therapy. So if you're watching an English television show and the guy goes to see a psychiatrist, potentially they will start doing psychodynamic therapy. It's really kind of interesting. And we just don't do it in the United States very often. Okay. Psychoanalysis often takes years because of the resistance in the form of ego defense mechanisms that the client uses to stay away from unpleasant thoughts. The hardest thing to do is to break through those defense mechanisms. But we have to identify them. We have to identify the fact that you're rationalizing. We have to identify the fact that you're in denial or that you're repressing these thoughts. It's really kind of interesting. If you had talked to me while I was breaking up with my first wife, I was in denial. I was in denial of what was going on. So if you said something like about an affair, you know, it's like I didn't hear what you said. What did you say? Did you say share? And then you'd say affair again. I said, you mean the fair? You want to go to the fair? You know, that's the way that you block the idea, this negative idea. You try to stay away from the negative idea, as bizarre as that sounds. I know, this is fun. So the defense mechanisms will create a resistance, and you have to break through that resistance to get into the collective unconscious. The client will begin the recovery process by beginning to feel toward the therapist the way that they feel toward their significant other. Usually their conflict has to do with their parents, has to do with their mother, has to do with their father, may have to do with their uncle or their grandfather, could have to do with anybody. So they have to start feeling toward you the same way they feel toward them. They have to accept you the same way they accept their grandfather. They love their grandfather. So they have to transfer that feeling for their grandfather onto you, or their mother onto you, which gets kind of interesting. And this is known as transference. As they relive the conflict, and this is what they have to do, they have to relive the original conflict that caused the problem. Once they relive the conflict that caused the problem, the therapist can relieve the conflict because the client has transferred their feelings from the conflictual person to the therapist. And it may be that their father yelled at them at one point and said he hated the child. I hate you. The kid was only 5 years old. He said, I hate you. And of course the child represses this because he doesn't want to think about it. And so once this takes place and they have transferred the feelings of the father onto the therapist, now when they relive this incident, they will transfer since they have transferred the feelings from the father to the therapist, now the therapist can say, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. And they will accept that as if they were talking to their father, despite the fact their father's been dead for 50 years. Relieving the conflict is known as catharsis. It's relief, and that's what catharsis means. You're releasing all of this anger that you have toward your father, and it's causing all of these repressed feelings. Now all of a sudden, you don't have those feelings anymore. You don't worry about these things. You're not obsessive compulsive anymore. Everything has changed. We fixed you because of catharsis. The process of dealing with conflict and catharses in the person is known as working through a conflict, and of course sometimes working through a conflict can take an extended length of time. And for this reason, of course, a lot of people do not want to do psychotherapy. It takes too long. It's too expensive. You have to talk to a psychiatrist. If you go to Harvard, they don't teach you how to use Rogerian therapy or Jungian therapy or Gestalt. They teach you how to use psychotherapy at Harvard. That's one of the reasons why they're not members of the APA, American Psychological Association. All right. They're members of the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. I know, they don't publish any journals. They're kind of funny people. Okay, we're done with Freud. Let's talk about somebody else, somebody more fun. How about Jung? Carl Jung. Okay. Anytime we're talking about any of these therapists, a lot of times the therapy that they came up with, the theory that they came up with, had to do with their childhood. Freud, there's a deal about Freud. Freud was hung up on his mother. Why was he hung up on his mother? His mother married his father when she was 16 years old. He was 50 years old. He had already raised a family. So he started impregnating her. But he wasn't very nice to his wife, the 16-year-old girl. So her first child was Sigmund Freud. And so she gave all of the affection that she would have given her husband, doing nice things for him, patting him on the head. She gave all this affection to Sigmund. So Sigmund was hung up on his mother. Okay? As bizarre as that sounds. So he was treated by his mother with a lot of affection. Far more affection than most children are treated. He was treated like the golden child. He was treated like the most significant person in her life. He was the most significant person in her life. She had 6 children. And if they didn't have enough food, guess who ate? Sigmund. They did everything for Sigmund. Sigmund was supposed to go out and earn a lot of money, and then he was supposed to educate the rest of his children, the rest of the kids in the family. These weren't his kids. And guess how many kids he had?
0.
6. Just like his mother. I know. He gets really strange. Okay, so Sigmund was kind of hung up on his mother. Carl Jung was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. Fascinating guy. He was everybody else in Vienna in this circle, this psychological circle. Adler, Horney, all of these individuals were Jewish, but Jung was not. Jung was not even Austrian. He was Swiss. He came from Switzerland, and his father was a Swiss Reformed Church minister. So when he came up with his theory to argue with Freud, who was Jewish, he was Christian. When he came up with his theory to argue with Freud, he came up with one that kind of mirrors Christianity. As odd as that sounds. He came up with archetypes. Where the hell did these archetypes come from? I say no, because they came from someplace holy. Okay? He came up with these archetypes. And he felt that we all have a collective unconscious. And that all of these ideas are in our brains right now. We get them from our parents. Or we get them from our genetics. So we have all these archetypes. We have, one of the archetypes is a powerful God. Tell me if this sounds like a book that you've read, okay? Powerful God, a fertile and nurturing mother. The young hero. Da-da-da-da-da. Wise old man. Themes of rebirth and resurrection. Does that sound like anything you've ever read before? Wait a minute. Swiss Reformed Church. Do you know anything about the Reformed churches? They're very strict. They tend to be very strict. So the Dutch Reformed Church, very strict church. Very fundamentalist church. So he grew up in a fundamentalist home. His father was the minister. My God. I know. So he comes up with a theory, and look what that theory looks like. It looks like the Bible. He used this theory to argue with Freud. Freud was the first guy. He came up with the theory first. And everybody started arguing with him. They said, "You're wrong, Sigmund. Doesn't have anything to do with sex. You're wrong, Sigmund." So when they started putting their theories together, they put their theories together to argue with Freud. And this guy was a fundamentalist Christian. And what does he come up with? He comes up with a theory right out of the Bible. As bizarre as that sounds. During World War II, all of this is taking place in the early the 1920s. And during World War II, guess which side this guy backed? Guess which side Sigmund backed? He was Jewish, of course. They were exterminating the Jews. Guess which side this guy was on? He was a Nazi. I know, as bizarre as that sounds. Okay, so he creates a theory that fits right in with the Bible, and it turns it just coincidentally, his father was a fundamentalist minister, as bizarre as that sounds. We're going to stop right here because the next guy is Adler, and he was Jewish. He was actually Jewish, and he was another contemporary of Freud's. But this is a theme that we can follow all the way through. We can